This time we're going to take a look at another modernist figure, Kawabata Yasunari, and one of his most famous novels called Snow Country. We noticed in lecture 35, the one on Ichiyu Higuchi, that the avant-garde movement in the West when Japan started its enforced westernization was realism. So that when Japan modernized its literature, it did so in terms of realism. By the time we get to this novel, however, which was written in the 1930s and it was published in its final form in 1947, the avant-garde movements in the West included some of the isms that we've been mentioning in the last lectures, things like futurism and cubism and expressionism and Dadaism, all of which are going to make their impact on the novel in Japan as well. Kawabata, for example, admitted the influence of James Joyce's Ulysses on his own writing. He said he had read it twice. He read it once in English and he read it once in a Japanese translation. And he also admitted the influence of Freud, whom he had read and whom he admired very much. In the early years of his writing career, Kawabata belonged to a group that was called the New Sensibilities, whose aim was to rescue Japanese literature from realism and naturalism. And all of these influences are going to show up in his novel, Snow Country. Because the novel, Snow Country, it's full of strikingly modern features. Henry James had reminded everyone, had taught writers around the turn of the century, that everybody's story is somebody's story, so that either first or third person limited point of view became normative for the psychological realist novel. First person point of view was almost always an engaged one as well, meaning that the narrator is a participant in the story, not simply an observer. The principle of the Jamesian revolution was in part derived from Immanuel Kant, who had taught us that I may never know what the world is like out there, but I know for sure what it looks like to me. And so an individual's perception of the world has to be inscribed into the novel in order to make it as close to the way that we experience the world as is possible for literature to get. Kawabata in this novel is going to use a third-person limited point of view, and so everything that happens in the novel comes to us through the mind and sensibility of its protagonist, a man named Shimamura. That is, we're inside his head all the time, so that all of the events and all of the other characters are colored by his sensibilities by the time they get to us. So, and this is true of always in a novel of this sort, we need to get to know him well enough to be able to decide if we agree with his assessment of other characters. We need to get to know him well enough to know whether we would behave differently or the same as he did in similar situations. And the same way we do with our friends. When our friends tell us a story, we're always silently adjusting for proclivities and biases that our friends have. So as we get to know the sensibility through whom the events of the novel come to us, we have to make those kinds of adjustments as we're reading as well. We've already had some experience with this, as we had to do with Nellie Dean and Lockwood in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and even to some extent we had to make some adjustments for Huck Finn, since we have to keep in mind the kind of boy Huck is in order to understand what it is that he's telling us. We'll come back to this later on in the lecture, because Shimamura's character and sensibility have posed some problems for readers over the years, both in Japan and in the West. Also, going back to the things that we said about the fiction of Proust and Joyce, and we'll say about Faulkner in our next lecture, modern fiction also tries to capture in language something of the way that we actually experience the world around us. We've mentioned this one before, but it's worth mentioning because it's a very important and very powerful essay at the beginning of the century, Virginia Woolf's essay called Modern Fiction. And as we've reminded ourselves before, what she says is that if we think about it, we are bombarded all the time by what she calls an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. That is, sensory and intellectual stimuli that make our consciousness very different from that of the orderly accounts that we get in most literature, which by the time we get them have already been categorized and edited and organized by the rational intelligence. A really accurate account of what goes on in my mind at any given moment would have to include everything that happens there. It would have to include all the impressions and the sensations that flit across it and trigger others. so that, making associations important, so that consciousness at any given moment is what's happening both externally and the thoughts and feelings and memories and associations that those things stimulate. And in many ways, of course, what that means is that at any given moment, our consciousness is likely to be a disjointed or illogical or associative mass of things. And that's what occupies our attention at any given moment. Remember when we did the Chinese novel Monkey, that we talked about a Chinese proverb that says the mind is a monkey. And in a way you can understand the validity of that. The mind is always jumping around, moving from place to place, doing many, many things at one time. We used this example in the Proust lecture, but it's worth mentioning again, because if you were asked what you had been doing for the last 10 minutes, you'd say that you had been paying attention to a lecture on Kawabata, and that so far the prof hasn't actually gotten to Kawabata. He's simply talking about some general characteristics of modern fiction generally. But we also realized by the time you said that, you would have eliminated almost everything that was going on in your mind during those 10 minutes. You'd have edited them down into a realist novel. One of the techniques that writers came up with to try to capture this experience of consciousness more accurately is called stream of consciousness, which tries in some measure to record that disjointed, associative way that the mind functions, and thereby get closer in literature to the way that we actually experience the world. We've actually encountered a sort of modest use of stream of consciousness at the very end of James Joyce's The Dead, when Gabriel Conroy's mind begins to drift westward in his meditation on his wife's adventure with Michael Fury when they were very young. That's a stream of consciousness. A very moderate stream of consciousness, but a stream of consciousness nevertheless. Joyce uses the technique more often and more elaborately, of course, in Ulysses, where we are typically inside the head of Stephen Dedalus, or Leopold Bloom, or at the very end, Molly Bloom. And in each case, we are recording that Woolf's incessant shower of innumerable atoms as it falls on whosever head we happen to be inside of at that moment. Virginia Woolf herself, of course, uses the technique very brilliantly in novels like To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway. And as we will see in our next lecture, Faulkner uses it very brilliantly in As I Lay Dying. In this lecture, our concern is with Kawabata's use of technique to record the experience of his protagonist, Shimomura, whose consciousness, as we said, we are confined to during the course of this novel. The technique of being confined to an individual consciousness in any novel is always a challenge for the reader, since we have to grasp the associative processes by which the mind works, this particular mind works, and then gather those fragments into some kind of whole, the way, say, T.S. Eliot's Fisher King has to do at the end of The Wasteland. And then we also have to decide whether some kind of coherence is even possible, whether a unified picture can be made out of all of the flotsam and jetsam that we've gotten in this stream of consciousness, or whether the very incoherence of the images which are juxtaposed in this stream of consciousness is an accurate picture of the modern world, or at least an accurate picture of that mind's inability to grasp the modern world, a world in which most of the usual foundations and assumptions have been eroded or destroyed, and all we can ever have is a kind of random and startlingly juxtaposed series of images. Perhaps the stream of consciousness might be saying that's all that modern consciousness can ever be. These challenges are always inherent in every stream of consciousness technique wherever they're used, and these challenges are also inherent every time we are limited to some single point of view in a novel. They're even more intriguing in this novel because of the nature of Shimomura himself, who is an elusive character, if there ever was one. The novel is set in northwest Japan, where there is, in fact, I understand, a lot of snow in winter, and hence the title, Snow Country. Today, as I understand it, that part of Japan is a ski resort, so that the entire character of the area has changed from what it was in the 1930s, when it was noted more for its hot springs and for its snow. It was a place in the 1930s where a businessman could take a few days or a week off to relax, usually without his wife. We remember from Michio's story that in Japan, a man who could afford it had access to the pleasure quarter of Edo in a way that didn't jeopardize either his marriage or his standing in the community. And so in a way, the snow country in the 1930s in this novel is a kind of remote pleasure quarter for Japanese men. And to that snow country, Shimomura comes 3 times in a little less than 2 years in the course of the novel. Our problem with Shimomura is that he's such a detached, remote man. He is always more a spectator of life than he is a participant. He has a wife and children in Tokyo, but they're simply part of the background. They don't feature at all in the book. We never meet them. He never thinks about them. He seems wealthy enough that he can pretty much spend his life searching for pleasures of one sort or another. And we also discovered that he has interests. At one time, we are told that he had been interested in traditional Japanese dance, and he had studied it so thoroughly that he became something of an expert on it. But when his expertise became known well enough that actual dancers from the dance community began to ask him to help them, he abandoned his interest in Japanese-style dance in favor of Western-style ballet, which he never sees and hence can study only in books, so that it doesn't disturb his detachment. He was disturbed when his expertise actually threatened to become part of his life, and so he immediately switched to something that wasn't going to disturb his life at all. As he says, being an expert in Western ballet is like being in love with someone he's never seen, which is exactly the kind of arm's length relationship he wants. So he knows about himself that he is a detached man. The novel is about his relationship with, or perhaps attraction to would be a better way to say it, 2 women he meets in snow country. The first is a young woman that he meets on the train on his way to snow country, and the other one is a geisha he meets in the little town that caters to tourists in that snow country itself. With both, he avoids any kind of commitment. In fact, he always retreats when he feels himself getting too interested in, too attracted to the geisha, who's the more or less the central other character in the novel. So for us, it's really hard to get a measure of Shimomura, hard to take him in. The detachment that he feels from life keeps him detached from us too. Every time we think we may be on the verge of getting to know him, he does a graceful retreat, the same way he does with all of the things in the rest of his life, and we are left with simply a handful of impressions. The woman that he meets on the train is named Yoko, and for Shimomura, she stays pretty much disembodied throughout the entire novel, a kind of distant ideal. The scene in the train in which he first sees her is probably the most famous scene in the novel. It's an absolutely beautiful scene. It's getting dark, and when it gets dark, the lights are turned on inside the railroad car, and when the lights are turned on, that turns the window into a mirror in which he can see this young girl's face reflected. But he can also see the landscape moving past the window so that her face is superimposed on that moving landscape like a montage in film. At one moment, there's a distant light from a mountain that shines directly in the eye of the reflection of the young woman, making her eye look like a star. It's a stunningly beautiful description in this very early in the novel. And throughout the novel, from this moment on, Shimomura will associate her with cold, with distance, with the remote light of a star. He only sees her, in fact, once more during the entire course of the novel until the very end of the book. And that one confirms for him the impression he has of her. She's always associated with freshness, with cleanness, with coldness, with the outdoors. And for him, he always associates her with a star, and that association will return at the very end of the novel when the Milky Way features very largely in the final scene of the novel, which we'll get to in just a moment. It has been suggested by people that perhaps Shimomura is interested in Yoko because she's remote, because she's inaccessible, because she's distant like a star. That would be very much in character for him. The geisha, on the other hand, is not disembodied, is not remote, is not inaccessible. Yoko's color in the novel is white, and the geisha, whose name is Komako, her color is red. She and Shimomura become lovers almost immediately when he arrives in snow country. She seems to fall in love with him, and although she isn't required to have sex with him, she does, she chooses to. And throughout the entire novel, her physicality is insisted upon. She gets drunk. Shimomura notices her weight when she lies on him. He always feels a palpable warmth when he touches her, and the powder on her face comes off in his hand. and he returns 3 times in 20 months to see her. So we have to ask, what is there about her that appeals so much to this diffident man? We understand his attraction to Yoko. He's an aesthete, he's a connoisseur who likes his pleasures at a distance, and her remoteness would appeal to him like Western ballet. But what about Komako? What is it that appeals to him about her? One thought is that it's her kind of ambiguity that appeals to him. She's neither, at least at the outset of the novel, she's neither explicitly one thing or another, but always hovering between definitions. When he first meets her, she is neither an independent young woman nor a geisha, but something in between. Kawabata always said that this was the character, Komako's character, is the one that he was really interested in this novel. And he was using Shimomura simply as a way of getting to her. And he spends a lot of time allowing her to us to understand her, even though all of the information that we get about her comes to us through Shimomura. We find out about her that she was born in the snow country, and then she was sold by her parents to a house of pleasure in Tokyo. We remember how this works. We remember that Midori and her older sister were sold by her parents in Child's Play. And so she starts in that pleasure house in Tokyo as a geisha's assistant, starts out pouring drinks. An old, wealthy patron buys her contract and starts her in proper geisha training, intending eventually to set her up as an independent dance teacher, at which she could have made a living, as does the woman with whom she lives in Snow Country. But her elderly patron dies before she completes her training, and she isn't sufficiently trained, so she returns home to find work. Since that resort is always chronically short of geishas, she's in demand at parties, even though she's not quite a real geisha herself yet. Maybe people have suggested maybe that's what appeals to Shimomura, her kind of in-between status. She's neither a girl nor a woman. She's neither independent nor a geisha. And for him, her character sort of reflects all of that ambiguity. She is, throughout the novel, a kind of interesting combination of childishness and maturity, of passion and reserve, of fire and ice. Her colors are red and white, and both of them are ambiguous. Red, of course, is the color of passion, it's the color of blood, it's the color of love, it's the color of the heart, and it's the color of the fire that burns down the theater at the end of the novel. But it's also the color of rosy cheeks in the snow, and since when Shimomura first meets her, she isn't wearing the white powder of a geisha. White is also Yoko's color. For her, the white means ice or snow or virginity or purity or the light of a star, but it's also the color of the powder worn by a geisha. So everything about Komako is ambiguous, is ambivalent, is difficult to pin down. And if Yoko in the novel is associated for Shimomura with stars, Komako is always associated with silkworms. There is a great deal of silkworm lore in this novel, which, if you're interested in silkworms, turns out to be an added bonus of this novel. It's a little like the whaling lore you can pick up when you're reading Melville's Moby Dick. Silkworms, we find out in the novel, begin as larvae and then become worms inside the cocoons, which are spun out of silk fiber. When they're young, they're characterized by redness, vitality, translucence. When they mature, they become moths, they stop eating, they breed, and then they prepare their own cocoons in which they lay their eggs, after which they die. So the characteristics of adults are dullness, lack of appetite, and whiteness from the powder that covers their wings. During his first visit to Snow Country, Komako takes Shimomura to her room in an attic that used to be used for raising silkworms. She seems to him then nearly translucent herself, like silkworms that used to be raised there, he thinks. On a later visit, by now Komako is a fully credentialed geisha, and she wears the white powder on her face, and this time Shimomura associates her with the egg-laying moth that he sees on his clothes frame in his room. She has by this time become the mature moth, something different from the translucent creature she was on his first visit, and we would think, for him, a little less interesting. Later, Shimomura takes a kind of backcountry tour that strengthens all of this attention to silk and to silkworms. We find here, as he discovers, that the origins of a particular kind of silk, chijimi, whose whiteness and sheen, by tradition, could be achieved only in material that is spun, woven, finished, and bleached in the glare of sunlit snow, and only then if it's done by girls between the ages of 12 and 24. That same ambiguous place that Shimomura finds Komako in on his first visit. The point is that Shimomura's fascination for Komako should be wearing off. She's no longer quite as remote, quite as ethereal, quite as ambiguous. She's gone, to use the metaphor of the silkworm, she's gone from larva to full-grown moth with powder on her wings. She's gone from being a young girl to a real geisha. He himself wonders about this. While she seems to have given herself to him completely, he's still his usual self, holding back, staying aloof. So he asks himself, why am I staying? What am I staying for? In one really key passage in the novel, he puts a tea kettle on, and the sound the tea kettle makes reminds him of the sound of wind through pine trees. When he puts his ear down to the tea kettle to hear it better, he sees in his mind Komako tripping along a path on her way to see him. That is what he notices, that everything reminds him of her these days, and so he decides it's time he'd better leave. So what he does is he visits the country where the Chijimi silk is made as a halfway stage before leaving snow country and going home. From time to time, he regrets vaguely the kind of man that he is, unable to make commitments or to enter fully into life. But he also knows that to admit regret would be to admit that his life up until this point has been something of a waste. And so he prepares to leave snow country, presumably for the last time. The final scene of the novel is a really amazing one, and it's beautiful and it's gripping, and it seems really profound without making clear, at least it doesn't make clear to me, how it is that we should respond to it or what we should make of it. Shimomura returns from his visit to the country of the Chijimi silk, and that evening when he's back, a fire breaks out in the old silkworm cocoon house, which is now used as a movie theater. He and Komako head toward the fire, noticing on their way how richly full and bright the Milky Way is that night. When they arrive, everybody has been saved from the burning theater except Yoko, who falls off the balcony and is killed in the fall. Komako rushes over to carry the dead girl away from the fire. And then, at the story's end, Shimomura throws back his head, into which flows the Milky Way. The ending seems to allude, in fact it quite clearly alludes, to what used to be a really important Japanese festival, the festival of Tanabata, which happened on July 7th. The story behind Tanabata was that of two star-crossed lovers, the herd boy and the weaver girl, who were turned into stars, one in each of the constellations Altair and Vega, which meant that they were at very opposite ends of the Milky Way, or the River of Heaven, as it's known in Japanese. According to the story, one night each year, crows build a bridge over the River of Heaven, and the two lovers are allowed to meet. On that night, young girls who observed certain kinds of rituals might dream of their future husbands, and in any case would be blessed by great skill in weaving. Perhaps this is a little like the kind of rituals that happen in Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes. The novel doesn't actually end on the evening of July 7th, but the huge presence of the Milky Way in the last pages suggests the meeting of two lovers. But our question is, my question is at any rate, is which two lovers are we talking about? The implication is that it should be Shimomura and Yoko, since she's the one who gets metamorphosed in the last pages. And at the end, the Milky Way flows down into Shimomura as an almost orgasmic experience. The reference to Tanabata, I think, is unmistakable, and I think for sure Kawabata wants us to think of this. Just a few moments earlier, Shimomura notices a group of nuns crossing a bridge or across a river, looking at a distance very much like crows. So all of the details are there. Everything is put into place. But our question at the end of the novel is, what do we make of this? What is Kawabata saying? We are left, as we so often are at the end of modernist texts, with a kind of open-ended conclusion, with a sense that the story isn't quite done, that there's more to come, that there's more to be said somehow. In a way, this story is like those that we read in the New Yorker each week. Slices of life that engage us, that are gripping, that grip our interest and our attention, so that when we turn the last page and discover that it is the last page, we feel a little disappointed when nothing is resolved, when the story simply seems to stop. We noticed earlier that it was Chekhov who really invented this kind of story for the modern world in his plays and short stories, and modern literature has pretty much followed his lead in that respect. Snow Country has moments along the way that just resonate with life, but we, or at least I should say, I'm speaking for myself here, at the end of reading this novel, I'm always left with the sense the story isn't quite over, that there's more to tell about Komako and Shimomura and Snow Country. It's one of the ways in which I suppose traditional fiction, modern fiction, differs from traditional stories and novels, which did try to reach conclusions, which really did try to tie up loose ends, which gave us some kind of more or less definite meaning that we could package and carry home with us. Here, we're inside the mind of a dilettante, a man who chooses never to make a real commitment, and we watch the action unfold through his eyes. And at the end, we have a difficult time reaching our own conclusion about what anything means or how to evaluate the characters in the story. An additional complication for us here is that the text is from Japan, a culture which we may not still quite understand, or at least which is different enough from our own that we have to allow for some differences. At the end, the question that we might ask is this an expression in some way of some Japanese trait that we don't get? That's what the Nobel Prize Committee suggested when they gave him the Nobel Prize in 1966, because the committee said that he had given to the world, quote, the essence of the Japanese mind. Now, when Kawabata made his acceptance speech, which we referred to back in Lecture 14 when we were talking about Japanese aesthetics, Kawabata in that speech referred to a lot of ancient Japanese poems and many Japanese rituals, the tea ceremony and flower arranging and others. As we mentioned in Lecture 14, one hearer of that acceptance speech described the speech as a forced march through a blizzard of cherry blossoms, which suggests that for both the Nobel Prize Committee and for Kawabata themselves, there is something essentially Japanese about this story. Kawabata's method of writing the story may have something to do with the novel's final shape too. He started the story in 1934, and it was published in its final version in 1947, by which time he had written parts of it as separate short stories and then combined and revised and added on to them for years. Tellingly, the fire that ends the novel was based on a real event which hadn't happened when he started writing the story in the first place, so he couldn't possibly have known where the story was going to end up, which is exactly what we said about the tale of Genji back in Lecture 15. So our question here, I guess, is whether the indeterminacy, the open-endedness, the feeling, as some critics have put it, that Kawabata has written a perfectly weightless novel is a function in some way of Japanese aesthetics or of modernism generally, or some combination. If it's a function of modernism generally, then it's an indication for us that we're not sure how to evaluate experience anymore, what to make of it, how to relate it to standards of reference that we're no longer sure apply. That is this novel in some way inherently Japanese, so that if we better understood Japanese aesthetics, we'd better understand this kind of book? Or is Kawabata simply a representative of a modern human being, aloof, detached, unwilling or unable to make commitments, and thus floating along on a river of modest pleasures that aren't completely fulfilling, but which nevertheless maintain his prized and important disengagement? At the end of the novel, we spent a lot of time with him, and another question that we ask at the end of the novel is, the better we get to know him, the more questions we have. Does getting to know him better help us to answer our questions, or does getting to know him better merely complicate our questions? Anyway, with Kawabata, we arrive at what has to be one of the central issues of modernism, in literature at any rate. Does experience make sense? Are there standards of reference outside the individual that can help to explain or guide us in what we do? Who gets to decide whether life has meaning or not? Is it necessary or even possible for us to judge Shimomura in this novel? And if so, on what basis do we do it? What ground do we have for making moral or aesthetic judgments? And if we find such a ground, how do we know that we're not simply applying some kind of provincial or ethnocentric standard of reference, simply applying our standards to someone from a different culture that functions in a different kind of way? These questions will stay with us for the rest of our course as we move further into the 20th century.